Welcome to the second lecture of the history of military engineering and the first lecture where we actually talk about the history of military engineering. Question: does anybody know what is the oldest complex hand tool, with the exception of the one person whom I told this to about 20 minutes ago?
Yeah.
The hand axe.
Damn it. Okay, yeah. Want to guess when it was first made?
Oh,
100,000 BC.
Let's try, well, okay, we'll get to the date in a little bit. But you are correct, the oldest manufactured hand tool was the bifacial hand axe. It's a two-faced stone tool that has knapping that is produced by knapping. So the process of knapping is you take a piece of flint and then you hit it with a harder stone so that you chip away pieces of the flint until you have something with a blade that is on both sides, so you would knap both sides of the stone axe. And usually what would happen is you would start with a core of flint, and from that core you would make several hand axes in one sitting. The oldest ones have been found to date around 3 million years ago. So right around the time that the genus Homo appears, these things start being produced. And the oldest ones, which are widespread and made to the same pattern from the Oldowan archaeological industry, they were produced between approximately 1.7 and 2.6 million years ago. So the term archaeological industry refers to a set of archaeological finds which appear to be made according to the same pattern. Older hand axes have been found, but those have usually been just single standalone, whereas with the Oldowans we see a clear evolution and consistency of the pattern of the hand axe that they're producing. So it would appear that they had some sort of culture where the method of producing hand axes was passed down from generation to generation and improved upon over the roughly million years that these were being produced. If you look at the proliferation of hand axes through the world, you can basically follow the proliferation of early hominids through the world, with the earliest ones being found within Africa, in places like Ethiopia, where the oldest Oldowan tools have been found, and Kenya being around 2 million years ago, reaching places like Tanzania by 1.8. The earliest evidence of hand axes outside of Africa are from Georgia, dating to around 1.7 million years ago. So these would be the oldest evidence of something made by hominids that was outside of Africa that is currently known. By 1.6, some have already been found in Pakistan, then Bulgaria, France, Italy, and so forth. If you notice also, the color here represents not only the age, but also the frequency with which these are found. Basically, by some point in history, hand axes were no longer functional to make. So you see a very small smattering of them in China, because by the time that hominids reached and really settled in China, they had moved on to more complicated tools that we'll see down the line. There was a fairly large variety of hand axe types produced by the early hominids. They ranged in shape from triangular to something that looks sort of like a heart, to something that looks more like an ellipse or an ovus, basically an egg, to just completely disorganized types which are sort of don't have any particular shape that they were aiming for. And what one finds is that within individual archaeological industries, they have several specific subtypes of hand axes that they make and usually stick to those. And between different archaeological industries, you can see that there are preferences for specific shapes, or specific amounts of knapping, or specific types of sharpness, and so on and so forth. Eventually, the hand axe evolved into a fairly large series of other tools. The first one that it probably evolved into is the hafted stone axe. The simplest way to add an axe to a handle or to haft it is just by using bindings either made out of animal skin or sinew or some plant material, and this would allow you to have a significantly stronger blow at whatever it is you were trying to hit with that axe. Also, it would mean that you do not have to bear the shock of the hit with your hand, but instead the shock of the impact is borne out by the stick, so therefore you can afford to hit with significantly more strength without fearing the damage to your own hand from the said impact. These also eventually evolved into stone daggers. where the initial daggers were typically just completely based in stone, but eventually also received handles, and these handles could have been made from wood or sometimes from animal bone or other material that could have been found lying conveniently about. And eventually these evolved into the stone-tipped spear. So the idea behind the spear is you have something that looks like just another descendant of a hand axe, but now it's added to the tip of a really, really long stick rather than some other shorter implement. And this would then actually leads us to the oldest dedicated weapon, the spear. Because with a hand axe, you can technically kill people or other things, but it's not only useful for killing. Whereas, or for instance, a dagger could be used to cut slabs of meat out of something that you just brought down that you want to cook. But a spear is really only dedicated to the question of how do I kill something, and then use other tools to process it after the fact. So in principle, the oldest pure weapon could be the spear. And the oldest evidence for spears was found in South Africa, dating to around 460,000 years ago. These initial spearheads were probably attached to shafts using flexible bindings, because at the time that these were developed, there were still no adhesives, there was nothing that was analogous to glue. And the primary reason that these particular pieces are suspected to be spearheads is that they show fracture damage that's consistent with something that's thrown as a spear, so damage to the points rather than much of the sharp face. Also, they show evidence of being resharpened to maintain symmetry. Usually, if you find hand axes or other early stone tools that were resharpened, they're only resharpened from one side because it doesn't really matter as long as you have an edge. But if you're throwing a spear, you want to make sure that it's as symmetric as possible, so therefore you resharpen it from both sides, and these are the oldest pieces of found stone manufacture that were resharpened in a way that would be consistent with using a spear. It's possible that wooden spears existed earlier. There's some evidence for spear use by chimpanzees. So here you see a chimpanzee holding a sharpened stick, which is part of a video where you see that chimpanzee stick that stick down a log and spear a poor little animal that it then ate. So chimpanzees have the ability to hunt using spears. However, some researchers point out that it is possible that they're just mimicking humans and that they did not come up with this on their own. But it's really impossible to tell when the very first purely wooden spears would have come up because wood would completely rot away. There is possible evidence that would indicate possible use of wooden spears that goes around to 500,000 years ago, such as animal bones with circular holes cut into them. This would probably have been caused by throwing a spear at the animal from a great distance, and then the animal having part of that bone broken away by the spear. But there's only circumstantial evidence that we have prior to those spearheads that were discovered in South Africa. The oldest full-sized surviving spears date to 400,000 years ago. So these are purely wooden spears without heads, but they are in fact throwing spears. These were preserved in a peat bog near Schöningen in Germany, and what most likely happened was the early hominids that would have produced these would have been hunting next to some lake or some bog, and some of their spears may have been accidentally dropped into the bog and never recovered. And because a peat bog is a very oxygen-free environment, the spears would not rot, and therefore they were saved for modern researchers to be able to find them. These particular ones were carved from the trunks of spruce trees, and their shape indicates that they were dedicated to be thrown rather than thrust. So it would seem that early hominids, as early as 400,000 years ago, were already using spears to hunt big game, so something like mammoths or other large animals which you would not want to face just by holding a spear in your hands. And in principle, if you think about the spear as the progenitor of all polearms, the spear has been the longest used weapon of war. So over here, we see an Australian Aboriginal who uses his spear to fight off various invaders. Here we see a model of ancient Egyptians that was made by the ancient Egyptians, and every single soldier is carrying a spear. The ancient Assyrians used spears as a standard weapon. The ancient Greeks used the spear as the main weapon of the phalanx. The sword was only intended for close combat in case the phalanx got broken up. The Persians used spears heavily. The Romans used spears and javelins. The Sassanid Empire, which inherited Persia from the Achaemenid Empire, used spears. The samurai used spear-like weapons, which had sword-like blades but still mounted at the end of a long stick, so they technically still count as a polearm. The Incas used spears quite widely. The Vikings used spears. And for the last two, we get to an interesting period in history where spears were used alongside the first firearms. So these guys are the Spanish terciaries, and these are the Russian streltsy, which literally means shooters. Both of these used spears as their primary weapon for close combat, and the early guns, so the progenitors of muskets, as their long-range firearms. Eventually, the firearms became, as the firearms became more efficient and reloading them became faster, the spears gave way. But in a way, you could think about modern bayonets on rifles and assault rifles and other weapons as basically the same continuation of the concept of having something long that you can stick out and stab people at farther than arms reach. Around 200,000 years ago, we see the oldest evidence for the use of adhesives, and incidentally, this was used to create daggers and spears. What was found were these particular pieces of rock, which are believed to be spearheads, and when scientists analyzed this particular area, they found that it has chemicals that indicate it was originally tar, and most likely it was tar that was based on birch bark, known from what we know about that particular area's ecology at the time. And there was some initial debate among archaeologists whether you could possibly produce enough tar to make a reasonable amount of glue. So some experimental archaeologists took some bark, heated it up in a wooden ash, and after a few experiments got a fairly nice amount of tar. So we have now experimental evidence that it is possible to produce sufficient amounts of adhesive and glue from just some tar. The first evidence for complex adhesives, which use a mixture of multiple ingredients, dates to 70,000 years ago from South Africa. So in this case, they used plant-based gums, which was mixed with red ochre, basically rust, but it's a mineral kind of rust. And the resultant adhesive, which you get from mixing red ochre into your gum, gives you a more robust and less brittle structure, also more water resistant. So this spearhead that you would attach with this would be significantly longer lived and would have a less likelihood of breaking away when you chuck it at some bison, and you will be with a greater chance of getting food back home. Also, as a side note, a little bit on the development of culture. So the earliest hominids left not much, or truly, actually, not really any evidence of having something based like a culture, because anything that they would have done at the time didn't survive the 2.5 million years that passed between them and us. However, if you look at more recent hominid evolution, we have the advantage of cave paintings, where cave paintings have been produced as far back as 40,000 years ago, as we see with these red ochre discs in Spain. And what they allow us to do is basically see a little bit of a glimpse at the lives of ancient mankind, at least in the way that they illustrated it. And what do we see in cave paintings? Well, we see what primitive man thought was most important about life. Most importantly, it's contemporary fauna, the things that they would like to eat. Very frequently you see representations of bulls. In fact, the largest cave painting known is a gigantic black bull that is about 4 meters in length for the entire bull in terms of its drawing. You see animals like bison and buffalo appear fairly frequently. Less frequently, but still occasionally, you see larger animals such as woolly rhinoceros. The theory is that these would be represented less frequently because they would be more challenging to hunt and therefore less attractive to a hunter-gatherer society, but still they were part of the lives of people in ancient Europe. They were drawn on various caves. Very, very rarely you see representations of mammoths, but they occasionally crop up in the record of cave paintings as well. And we also see the tools and weapons that were available to people, as well as scenes of hunting. So in this particular case, what we are observing, or at least as far as archaeologists believe, is a bull that was struck by a spear, but that is in the process of goring down a poor hunter who probably stabbed him with the said spear. And this particular object has been described as possibly some sort of ceremonial tool that looked like a bird. So perhaps this was some sort of shaman or clan leader that would have had his own, basically, chief stick. As we see further cave paintings, the hunting becomes more complicated. You see more people participating in hunts, and we see clearer representations of spears and other weapons. This is a more recent example from South Africa. And eventually we get to warfare, but we'll get to warfare in cave paintings in just a little bit. Also, we see the appearance of three-dimensional figurative art. The very first one that is currently known is this Lion Man from Germany, dated to approximately 38,000 years ago. This particular piece is a piece of ivory that was carved with a stone knife. Though the reason why it's a lion with a face of a man, or a man with a head of a lion is unknown, but possibly some ceremonial or legendary purpose. And as we see through the ages, one of the most common topics for carvings, rather than cave paintings, is various fertility figures, such as this Venus of Hassepouy from France. This is the earliest known 3D depiction of something like a realistic human face. And we do also see some carvings of contemporary animals, which give us indications as to what these people were interested in hunting, killing, presumably eating, such as this mammoth from 30,000 years ago. And some of these carvings might have been ceremonial. This is a carving out of a fairly sizable rock found inside of a cave that represents bison. The idea is that these might have been used as some sort of ritualistic bison, where hunters would throw their spears at the stone bison and hopefully attract the attention of some deity or other that would help them chuck their spears better at real bison. But possibly not, as mostly just archaeologists looking at bison and saying, what can we do to write a paper about this? So everything said about cave paintings should really be taken with about the Mediterranean worth of salt. Finally, we get into the introduction of true ranged weapons. Everything up until this point has been either held in hand, like a spear, or thrown by hand, like a spear or a javelin. Around 18,000 years ago, we see the introduction of a weapon called the atlatl. This is effectively a stick which you hold in your hand. At the back, there's a little hook point which pushes against an arrow, and what it allows you to do is it adds an extra length to your arm as you are throwing a spear or a javelin. The way that an atlatl is used is you hold the dart between your thumb and your index finger, while you hold the rest of the atlatl in the rest of your fingers and hopefully have it attached by a strap to your hand. And when you throw the dart, you hopefully release it at the point where the hook is pushing the dart immediately forward, so that you have the best possible speed of the dart in a forward direction. With a very well-trained user, you can throw a dart at speeds up to 100 kilometers an hour, and you can get a maximum range on these of about 100 meters, as found by people who study atlatls and make their own in practice. But if you want to have really good aim and hit something at fairly good speed and kinetic energy, your aiming range is mostly limited to around 20 meters, which is still pretty good if you're hunting a mammoth. You want to make sure that you can hit it from 20 meters instead of 5 meters, therefore you have more time to run away in case you fail to kill it. And after the atlatl appears around 6,000 years later, we see the oldest evidence of bows and arrows. So unfortunately, most bows, or technically arrows from the period, would not have survived because they would have been made out of materials that can rot very easily. However, arrowheads do survive, and the oldest artifacts that are identified as arrowheads date to around 12,000 years ago from two cultures which lived at the same time, from the Arnburg culture from Germany and from the Bronze culture in Denmark. And the reason that these are identified as arrowheads is because they are much smaller than spearheads, and so they would be useless on a atlatl javelin or on a spear. They also, some of them show evidence of having additional details to make it easier to haft into a smaller stick, therefore something that would indicate that they were hafted into a significantly smaller shaft than a javelin would require. And some of them also have broken tips, which might indicate that these were in fact used as arrows and they hit against something hard and their tips got broken off. And in order to hit at that speed, you need to be shot out of a bow and arrow rather than just thrown by hand. So all of these conclusions are really made on very, very circumstantial evidence, but considering that from 12,000 years ago, it's a miracle that we have any evidence at all, this is the best knowledge that we are currently able to have. The advantages of bows is that a bow is much easier to use than an autolotl. So while with an autolotl you need to have a lot of practice to make sure that your chuck is very precise and you can have good enough strength and speed and control to make sure the javelin goes in a straight line and hits something rather than just goes wildly into the air. With a bow and arrow, the training is significantly easier and it's a lot more affordable for the common man to learn how to use it. Also, unlike an autolotl, the bow and arrow do not rely on raw body strength, because with an autolotl, you're still using just your raw strength to push the javelin forward, whereas with a bow and arrow, you're using the energy that is collected in the shaft of the bow as you withdraw it. So you are no longer required to be an extremely big and brawny person, just barely big and brawny to hold the bow and then you're good. Also, the lower projectile weight means that you can shoot at a faster speeds, so it's easier to hit a prey which is moving, and it is also easier to shoot the bow and arrow farther than an autolotl, which is useful in case in the following millennia as war begins to proliferate. The oldest discovered bows are incidentally not actually all that much younger than the oldest discovered arrowheads. They're only about 9,000 or date to around 9,000 BC. And these were the Holmgard bows, which were again found in a peat bog, but in this time in Denmark rather than in Germany. Cave paintings at some point around 7,000 BC also begin to show bow and arrow use. One of the oldest ones was from the La Valtorta Gorge caves in Spain. And this, as far as we know right now, is the oldest representation of somebody using a bow and arrow. We do not know what this person was trying to use it against, because the rest of the cave painting has gotten very eroded, and this particular thing was actually recreated from a very blurry image using artificial intelligence, basically mapping. So we do not know if this was supposed to be used against another person or against an animal, but we know that at this time bows and arrows were at least used. And what we see is, in subsequent millennia, we observe a more complicated representations of bows and arrows in use against large groups of animals by hunting parties. And eventually, at some point, we begin to have the first evidence of bows and arrows being used against other people shown in cave paintings. So we'll get to that in just a few slides. Right around the time that bows and arrows appear, we also begin to have the oldest evidence for intergroup warfare. So the oldest known site, which is believed to be associated with a location of warfare, is the so-called Cemetery 117 in the Nile Valley. Unfortunately, this whole place is right now underwater because in the 1960s the Egyptians built the Aswan Dam, and a lot of archaeological sites up in the up in the source of the Nile were flooded. But the scientists were able to gather as much information as they needed to. So this is the information, the data they gathered from this place is still being studied even to this day. What we see in Cemetery 117 is 61 skeletons and partial remains, of which at least 26 show very strong evidence of violent death, so things like cuts and fractures, and some of these show evidence of healing. At least 21 skeletons, not necessarily out of those 26, still have embedded stone points, and one body was found with 39 flint fragments in it. So presumably this person was hit by 39 arrows and then died, and nobody removed those arrows from him. It was found that the bodies belonged to two human groups, one group from sub-Saharan Africa, one group from Mediterranean North Africa. So the current theory is most likely right around this time the climate of Africa was undergoing an aridification cycle, so it was becoming drier and therefore food was becoming more scarce. So most likely what happened was the group from Mediterranean ended up traveling south in search of better pastures and more food, and ended up stumbling onto the territory of this group from sub-Saharan Africa. And what the skeletons in this cemetery show is that over the course of several generations, these two groups have been killing each other at very slow rates, and then piling all the bodies of everybody who was killed in that inter-group warfare in this joint cemetery, for reasons that we probably will never know, but it now gives us the oldest evidence of consistent, possibly multi-generational conflict between groups of people. And from this point on, we also begin to see the first cave paintings that depict group conflict. The very first cave paintings that depict people just being killed in general date back possibly even as far as 30,000 years ago, but these usually just have a single person who was stabbed by a single spear. So it's possible that it might be a misrepresentation or misunderstanding, because something that looks like a spear could just be a line accidentally left by someone or being defaced by some tourists. And there is, because these are so rare, it's also possible that it might just have been representations of people killing each other over who killed the mammoth or who's going to get food. So not really warfare, more interpersonal conflict at worst. But around 9000 BC, and the earliest evidence for this is found in the Bradshaw rock paintings in Australia, we begin to see the first representations of large groups of people in conflict against each other. And what we see in this case is one painting where a group of people holding straight objects, presumably spears, and another people holding straight objects, presumably spears, all pointing those spears against each other, and possibly a third figure in the middle who might have gotten broken away from his group or perhaps got killed and left behind. But in general, what we see is a group of people and a group of people that are facing each other with violent intent on both sides. This is believed to be a cave painting of a battle, if you can see anything from the details. But from comparisons with other Australian cave paintings of the period, people identify that over in this image you can see two rows of people, some of which have various objects that appear to be struck through them, others of which appear to be striking straight objects through each other. So essentially a small engagement that was left for future generations to see. And the possible reason for all of this violence is, again, the same reason. So right around this time, the entire Earth was going through a process of aridification, and there was increasing human population density. So as you have more people competing for a smaller amount of resources, eventually violence erupts because you either have to get food or you die of starvation. And as you have the introduction of bows and arrows, you now begin to have cave paintings portraying violence using these said bows and arrows. One of the early examples is from another Spanish cave, also dated to approximately 7000 BC. And here we see people with bows trying to kill each other, presumably because there's no animals anywhere in this picture to be observed. And it is believed that warfare, or early tribal warfare, might have become more proliferated as bows and arrows became more prevalent, because with a ranged attack it's easier to initiate and easier to disengage, because if you're using a spear or a javelin you have to come fairly close to the other group before you can throw it, and after you throw it you have no guarantee that the other group isn't just going to catch up to you and kill you. But with a bow and arrow you can do an ambush attack very easily, you can attack from very far away and at a distance where you can safely run away to your own camp, or run away and hide before the other group will attack you. So in principle, it's easier to just kill and forget about it, rather than kill and then have you yourself be killed right away in retribution. And at this point, also, we begin to see the first evidence of settling of societies going into an organized set. So the very earliest societies that probably existed would have been hunter-gatherers, that would have been able to migrate between regions as migratory animals do. And what we see around 9000 BC is the beginning of something called the agricultural revolution. So at around 9000 BC in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, we see the first evidence of people actually choosing to sit in the exact same place over many, many years and cultivate some sort of plant material and tend to their farms, rather than migrate all over the place and just feed off the land. And we see that there's a proliferation. So by 7000 BC, the first agrarian societies appear in the Yellow River Basin in China. By 6000 BC, they actually proliferated even into New Guinea. By 3000 BC, they proliferate into Mesoamerica and South America, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. And what this means is that now, if a society has staked out a claim for land, it will defend that land against another society that might want to come in and take that land for their own use. So, as of the foundation of the first settled agrarian societies, we also see the necessary precondition for war to become significantly more prevalent within the lives of humanity. And among the archaeological sites which are currently known anywhere in the old world, the oldest one that seems to indicate some sort of organized society is a site which is called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. It's believed to be currently the oldest identified artificial structure. Here you see the archaeological dig site, and here you see a restoration of what it might have looked like during when it was being used. The belief is that it might have been a temple complex, although that belief is very frequent among archaeologists who say, "What is this? I don't know, it must be a temple." So it might have been used for various other purposes, but the official reason is that it might have been a temple complex. And at the time that this was built, around 9000 BC, the region where it was built in Turkey, in Anatolia, there was no farming, there were no domesticated animals, there was no writing, even the wheel was still thousands of years away. So people who built this would have presumably been a group of hunter-gatherer societies who, for some reason, came together and built this in the middle of nowhere. And there's a theory that is out that suggests that perhaps it was this construction project that brought together a number of hunter-gatherer societies and forced them, or at least motivated them, to settle and become agrarian societies, because in the region around Göbekli Tepe, within 500 years, we see the first evidence for wheat farming. So the society that built this presumably settled down fairly quickly and became farmers. And we see evidence of sheep herding by 8000 BC, one of the earliest indications of domestication of animals. Right around a few thousand years down the line, we now begin to also see the first writing systems appear and develop. The oldest possible writing system has been identified as the Jiahu symbols from China, dated at oldest to around 6600 BC. However, there is some amount of debate about these because the number of symbols is fairly limited, and most linguists concede that they probably would not have been a complete writing system, but more of a pictogram system, where these were not intended to represent language, but more just concepts. Similar set of symbols come from the Balkan Peninsula, the so-called Vinca symbols. We see there's a progression of Vinca symbols as they were used for about 1500 years that progress from just a very simple set to significantly more complexity. Most of these are known from pottery from the region. There's a theory that these might have been basically used to keep track of inventory of pottery that was made, but there is such a variety of them that it's tempting to think that perhaps these might have also been used to convey down language, so perhaps ownership of the pot or who produced the pot, and so on and so forth. Another example of possible proto-writing systems are the Dispio symbols from Greece. They date around 5200 BC. Again, these are known from just a couple of tablets, so we'll probably never know what they were supposed to mean if this was a language, and if it wasn't a language, it might have also been just a pictorial system to convey some sort of thematic message, but not necessarily writing down the actual words themselves. The proper writing system, from these early proto-writing systems, we have the evolution of the first proper writing systems, where we know and have evidence that the symbols indicate actual words and sentences. The first writing system that is known is the Sumerian cuneiform from Mesopotamia. That eventually was perfected to its first full form around 3500 BC. And from this point on, we have the advantage of having writing tell us what happened to people who lived at the time. Whereas for earlier periods, we could either rely only on circumstantial evidence, such as broken spear points or pieces of wood and rock, and then we could rely on slightly more complicated evidence, such as cave paintings. Now we actually have people telling us what they did, what happened to them. So with writing, we get a significantly better record of what happened to various people in ancient history, and of course a record of what kinds of weapons and other systems did they use. From these first writing systems, or right around the time, in addition to writing, one more question that has to be addressed before we get into more advanced types of weapons is metalworking. The oldest evidence that indicates some sort of metalworking are various natural gold nuggets that were found with burials as old as 40,000 years ago, such as this example from Spain. And these were probably just nuggets that were found inside of a river that were shiny, so some chief would have thought, oh, that's a pretty thing, I want to wear it. And then we're buried with it, and we found these now in burials of various chieftains. Silver and tin nuggets were used in small quantities, also primarily as just shiny, fancy things that look sort of pretty. The first evidence for smelting comes from the Balkans, and it's dated to around 5500 to 5000 BC. This was associated with the Vinca culture, the one that, if you remember from a few minutes ago, had one of the first proto-writing systems. And the reason that we know that the Vinca were able to smelt is because in some of their dig sites, we find slag particles and then droplets of copper metal, which indicates that they were in fact melting copper and then producing something useful from it. As we look at the proliferation of metallurgy, we see that it appears partially in the Balkans and then very quickly proliferates into Anatolia, and then over the subsequent thousands of years, proliferates to much of the rest of the old world. With the dawn of metalworking and metal smelting, we get to the first metal tools. One of the earliest would have been the axe. This is an example of the axe that was carried by Otzi the Iceman, dated to 3200 BC, where the only part that's metal is just the tip of the axe at the very top. The advantage of having a metal axe over a stone axe is that obviously metal is significantly stronger than stone and will be able to serve you for a longer period than just a stone piece, because every time that you strike a stone, you have a very high risk of just fracturing it and completely losing the edge. Whereas with a metal axe, you can resharpen it, you can then use it for longer, and it'll be a more reliable tool to use. We see clothes making tools, such as this copper awl found in Israel, dated to around 4900 BC. And of course, we see spear and arrowheads. The oldest ones are dated maybe to around 3000 BC, but that dating is somewhat tentative. And we also see the evolution of daggers, with initially the length of daggers limited by the weakness of copper, because copper itself is a very soft metal. So if you make a dagger with a blade length above perhaps 20 centimeters, it'll be able to bend very, very easily, and it's not going to be a reliable weapon. So in order to solve the questions of how do we improve our weapons, eventually humans made it to bronze, where bronze is basically a copper alloyed with tin. Usually tin is around 15 to 17% by mass. And the first evidence for the use of bronze dates back to around 4500 to 3500 BC. And possibly some Vinca artifacts have been claimed to be made out of bronze that date of 4500 BC, but there is some amount of debate about this. And the oldest undebated artifacts are coming from Sumer and from Egypt, and these dates are around 3500 BC. The advantages of bronze over copper is that it is harder, stiffer, and more resistant to corrosion. So in general, it's a significantly more reliable material to be using for making either tools or weapons. Goodbye, sir. So with the Bronze Age, you see the introduction of new weapons, such as the first weapons that we could consider swords. This is an example of a sword from the Novoslobodne culture from the Caucasus Mountains, dated to around 3600 BC. The overall length of this entire sword is 63 centimeters, and the handle is just 10. So this is significantly longer than the daggers that we see being produced out of stone or bronze, or out of stone or copper, because bronze is much stiffer. This one has been bent because it was buried ceremonially with some particular chieftain, but we see that it is intended for use as a sword. So it has a slashing edge rather than being primarily intended to be as a stabbing weapon, and it is stronger built than just a regular copper dagger. These would have evolved from daggers, but copper daggers were typically much shorter, and they did not have the form that would allow you to slash rather than just stab an enemy. Improved metalworking technique, so with the addition of bronze, we also observed the introduction of new production methods, so such as molds. The oldest molds date to around 4000 BC, or at least tentatively date to around 4000 BC. And what this would allow is for significantly cheaper and faster production of components, because if you make a mold, you can just make spearhead after spearhead in the exact same mold, instead of having to beat your metal into some form and manually make every single spearhead by hand. We also see an introduction of new mobility systems around this particular time period. The wheel is believed to have been derived from the potter's wheel. The oldest pottery wheels date to around 4500 BC, and by 3500 BC we have possible illustrations of wheeled vehicles. This is called the Brononichi pot from Poland, and it's believed to depict some four-wheel carts, where the idea is that this is the body of the cart, this is where it would be hitched to some cattle, and these are supposed to be representations of wheels. Not entirely sure how actually legit that is, but that is the current understanding of this image, where archaeologists, the oldest discovered wheels date to actually not much farther down than that. This is a wheel discovered in Slovenia from 3200 BC. Also, it's the oldest axle that was ever found, together with the wheel. Another wheel that dates to 3100 BC, also in Slovenia, is presented here. And what you see is that these wheels are not made from just a single chunk of wood. However, they are instead made of individual slabs of wood, where the individual slabs are joined together by some sort of ribbing or interlocking structure. And also, we see the addition of new mobility systems for water. So the earliest flotation devices were very simple, such as rafts, where you just take a bunch of logs of trees and you connect them all together with rope, and then you use that to cross some waterway. You have things like coracles, which are basically oversized baskets, which would then be covered in tar or some other material which would make them waterproof, and then used to transfer you across a river. Some coracles have also been made out of pottery, so the largest ones that were still used into the 1800s in places like India could actually carry upwards of 20 people in a giant pot. So they worked pretty well, but they didn't really allow you to do much more than just cross a river or perhaps a small lake. Inflated skins. This is one of my favorite pictures because this is literally the inflated skin of a bull that's being used as a flotation device. And these were actually pretty common as well. This particular picture is from the Himalayas. What it doesn't show, so it shows one inflated skin, two, three, a fourth one being carried. And eventually, what people who lived up in the Himalayas would do is they could tie together as many as 100 of these skins together, put a gigantic raft on top of them, and use that to transfer several tons of goods to trading stations down the Punjab region. Hollow tree trunks are an obvious example for early methods to cross waters, and probably the closest analog to the grandfather of the boat. These would have basically been initially made out of tree trunks that were just found by the water, but eventually when people realized how to make them more reliable, cutting down trees and shaping them in a way as to make something that looks like a simplistic canoe. Around 5000 BC to 10,000 BC, we have the introduction of the reed boat. Basically a boat made out of bunches of reeds. These were fairly widespread in Egypt for transfer of goods down the Nile River. Possible depictions date as far back as 10,000 BC from cave carvings in Azerbaijan, as you can see right here. But the oldest remains that are associated with an actual reed boat have been discovered in Kuwait and dated to around 5,000 BC. Next, after reed boats, we have wooden plank boats. These appeared in Egypt around 3000 BC and were typically made out of shell-first construction. So this means that they built the shell of the ship first and then put in whatever ribbing on the inside is necessary to stiffen and strengthen the structure. More modern ships were more commonly built by creating the ribs first and then building the shell around them. However, that method appeared significantly later down the line. This example here is the Khufu ship, which was discovered at the Great Pyramid of Giza It's the oldest currently known intact ship, dated to around 2500 BC, 43 meters long and with a 5.9 meter beam. This particular one would not have been very waterworthy because it was built as just a ship to be buried with the pharaoh in his pyramid, but there is some evidence that it would have been floated down the river based on the deformation of some of the boards, and clearly it shows that by this time the Egyptians were capable of making fairly sizable ships that could be waterworthy. Also, we see the appearance of the first sails. The first sails were square sails, and we see evidence for them appearing also in Egypt, also around 3000 BC. These are known from pot paintings that show boats with small sail-like structures on them. Also, in this case, you see evidence of using oars. The artist went a little overboard on the number of oars that he depicted. And finally, we get to the first wars and empires. So we now have new methods of transportation, like wheels. We have boats. We have people settled in organized agrarian societies. Now they begin fighting and don't really stop until the modern day. Defensive fortifications appear really quickly after you see the first evidence of agricultural society. So very early walls have been found in Jericho that have been dated to 7000 BC, basically right after the area would have had its first settled society. Fortifications at Sisklo in Greece have been dated to around 6700 BC. These are the remains of some of the walls. Originally, these would have obviously been significantly taller. There's a very interesting fortification found at Solnitsatsa in Bulgaria, dated to 4700 BC. It's protecting a salt mine right here. Ideally, or in principle, the concept is that the people who built this defensive fortification would have been some small village that lived nearby and mined that salt and presumably sold that salt to other local tribes for a certain amount of payment. So to protect their main source of revenue, they built a fairly sturdy fortification around their salt mine. We also begin to see the first evidence of urban siege or assault. A site in Syria called Hamukar shows evidence of being violently destroyed around 3500 BC, and the evidence is in the form of hundreds of arrowheads and slingshots and various other weapons that were found to be inside the city, and in the destruction that was found among the buildings that were discovered at the site. And one of the current theories is that it might have been destroyed by Sumerians from the city of Uruk, because a little bit later down the line, there was an Uruk trading colony that was built at the site. So presumably as the Sumerians from Uruk were spreading their sphere of influence, this particular city did not want to be under the Sumerian sphere of influence, so it was destroyed. And finally we get to the first recorded war, where in 2700 BC, the Sumerian king, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, the Sumerians had very unusual names, and he was the king of Kish. So technically Kish itself was a city here, but in ancient Sumeria, a king would control his city as well as some of the land around himself. So it was not necessarily just the city itself. And he went to war against the kingdom of Elam. The kingdom of Elam in this case is shown at its height, so at the time it would have been significantly smaller and only had a few cities. And he went to war and he subjugated the kingdom of Elam. This basically just means he won a battle, got some tribute from them, and then went back home. And the major engagement of this was supposedly most likely happened not far from modern Basra in Iraq. This particular piece of information was pointed out by a U.S. Army historian right after the U.S. Army had a battle at Basra, and he pointed out that it's kind of ironic that there has been basically ongoing non-stop war there since 2700 BC, even according to records. We begin also to see new technology and new tactics being introduced. This is called the stele of vultures, where a stele is basically just a stone slab which has some sort of decoration, and it's intended as a place marker, but often these steles had either histories written on them or some particular events commemorated. So this is the stele that depicts the victory of Sumerian king Eannatum of Lagash over the city of Umma. Both of these are in Sumer. And this stele is very interesting for its historical significance. It's the oldest known image of a phalanx infantry formation. So earlier images of people going to war basically have individuals in sort of haphazard organization or just fighting by themselves. In here we see undeniable evidence that people are organized in a single formation where they are overlapping each other with their shields. They're sticking their spears out between their shields and moving together as a wall. This would indicate that these particular soldiers would have had extensive training, because if you want to make sure that you go to war with a formation of people, all of you need to be trained to work together, otherwise your formation will fall apart the moment you step outside the city gates. They are shown as being led directly by King Anadam himself. It's also one of the earliest depictions of a standardized shield. There are earlier depictions that have been identified as shields, but in this case we see that every soldier is carrying almost the exact same shield as his neighbor. It's the oldest known image of a helmet being in use. Related Sumerian finds show that helmets at the time would have been made out of bronze with a leather liner, and the theory is that it would have been a very effective weapon, a very effective defense against a weapon that would have been common at the time, which was the mace. Because with a mace, if you hit an unprotected head, it's fairly easy to crack it. But if you have a helmet with a leather liner that absorbs the deformation and the shock, your head is very well protected against impact. Similar, or not similar, but related helmets have been found, so such as the helmet of King Nesquandagug, something or other. This one was actually found in his burial chamber, and if you compare this to the helmet that's supposedly worn by King Anadam, you'll see several very strong comparisons. So both of these have a little bun in the back of hair. Both of these have a very defined ear being depicted on the helmet. Both of these have a little hairband as depicted. So it's very likely that the helmet that's depicted on the stele of vultures would have been very similar to the helmet that's depicted here. Yeah.
Do we know how they made like sheet metal and formed it into a helmet?
Yeah, so most likely what would have happened is they would have initially started with just a sheet and then beaten it over some particular form, which might have been carved out of either a rock or some wood. And then for fine work like this, it would have been beating with a very, very fine chisel to get individual lines out to work. So this is mostly a ceremonial helmet because it's made of very, very thin gold. But in this one, you can also see several major hallmarks. So these holes right here are where the leather liner would have been connected in. So what it would allow you to do is basically make sure that the leather then absorbs the shock of impact and your head is still protected even though the helmet is made out of gold. All of these structures over here would have been presumably made with very, very, very fine chisels and just a lot of work, because at the time there probably was no way to cast something as intricate as this and the available casting equipment that they would have had at the time.
Do you know how they made the sheets? Like how they actually made sheet metal?
I do not. I would imagine that they could pour the metal into a thin bath, wait for it to cool, and then beat a sheet out of it. Because basically beating a metal into shape has been around for significantly longer than casting, but it was mostly used to make small trinkets. So people were already aware of, if you are given a piece of metal, how do you beat it into something that's thin and pretty. You find beaten gold dating to like 10,000 BC with like small little trinkets that were buried with chieftains. So beating would have basically just been a lot of busy work with people who are paid to do this 24/7 their entire life over. Also on the image we see the oldest image of something called a hopesh. This was a curved sickle sword that was more famously associated with the Egyptians, with like the armies of the pharaoh. But in this case, we see a hopesh being carried by King Anadam in his hand, and possibly carried by implication carried by some of the soldiers. We also see the oldest, but unfortunately incomplete, image showing the use of a wheeled vehicle for war, where King Anadam is shown as riding something that basically is a chariot, except unfortunately the part with the wheels and the donkeys has been chipped off and fragmented. But the structure of his chariot is very similar to another painting that we'll see in just a few slides. And if this is in fact or not really a chariot, but more a war wagon, this would be the oldest known depiction of something with wheels being used for active war rather than just transport of goods. Also, what it appears to show is that he might be carrying a bunch of spears and might have been in the process of chucking a spear at the enemy. So more probably this would have been possibly just a single royal war wagon from which the king could throw javelins at the enemy while the rest of his army followed on foot. And talking about war wagons, we can also get to the standard of the war panel of the standard of dated to roughly 2500 BC. Historians are actually not sure what exactly this was supposed to be. They call it a standard, but it was found in a bunch of fragmented pieces. So if you see here, you'll see a lot of tiny little fragments that were very meticulously pieced together by archaeologists from an initial pile of rubble. And this one, just like the Stele of Vulture, shows soldiers wearing helmets. It shows something that looks like a war wagon being used. And among other things, it is the first depiction of something that's believed to be body armor. So you'll see that the soldiers are wearing cloaks with little circles on them. It's believed that it might represent little metal plates that might have been embedded inside of a cloak to make sure that you're a little bit better protected against incoming javelins and arrows than you are just by going with a cloak with no metal in it at all.
How would that help at all?
Well, so this is just a thematic representation, and this is a bit of a way too true representation. So more likely, these plates would have been significantly closer together and made more of a complete cover on the cloak. It's just that the artist didn't think about that particular detail when he was representing this. You also see the first time that war wagons are shown in more than one number and driven by people other than a king. And in this case, what has been suggested is that you actually see a horse trotting, then pacing, and I guess galloping for the third one. You see that the war wagons have crews of 2 people, where one of them is driving the donkeys, and the other one is managing the weapons. And we see on some of these that they also have that extra supply of spears that we saw on the chariot or in the war wagon that was driven by King Adam in the previous, in the Stele of Vultures. So this is the first depiction that we have of a vehicle with wheels being actively used to kill somebody and not just carry a king into battle, because you see various enemies of whoever these people were fighting underneath the war wagons and presumably dead. And as we look a little bit further into history, we see the first depictions of slightly more complicated helmets, so such as this horn helmet of Naram Sin of Akkad, dated to around 2240 BC. And as we observe these steles and other illustrations, it's important to remember that the very first expeditions were relatively low intensity. It was more of a raid rather than an expedition to conquer and hold enemy territory for a very long time. So most likely what happened was when you would have such a raid going into enemy territory, they would take some land, maybe get some tribute, but then everybody would go back. And normally these military expeditions didn't really extend too far outside of the cultural boundary, so people from Sumer would go to war against other people from Sumer, or would go to war against people from Elam, but it was really the same cultural boundary. Like, people from Sumer didn't go on these long expeditions into Egypt and fight the Egyptians. It was very, very local. And most of these expeditions, once again, were more raiding parties than actual military campaigns. So after whatever was required was taken, then everybody just went back home and called it a day. The real first empire that can be considered empire was founded by this guy called Sargon of Akkad. And this was a ruler of the kingdom of Akkad who conquered throughout his lifetime a significant portion of territory in Sumer, which was a different culture than the Akkadians. At his greatest expanse, he might have ruled as much as most of the Mesopotamian basin. He ruled around, well, according to one estimate, around 2330 to 2280 BC. And his empire, at the time of his death, would have been the first multicultural empire that didn't collapse right after his death. There might have been a couple of additional Sumerian kings who also attempted to conquer and maybe even held enemy cities for a little bit, but usually by the time they died, those cities rebelled and then everything went right back to being the way that it was before. But with the Akkadians and the empire that was initially founded by Sargon, this one lasted actually for around 4 generations. So his son and grandson and great-great-grandson, they still had control over the area that he conquered. And this particular type of event or this particular type of empire wasn't really seen in anywhere in the world in prior history. And this is the end of the lecture for today. So thank you very much for coming. We've gotten from the very first stones people chucked at each other to the very first empire. So it was pretty good.